Hi, this is Rachel Mayberry. I am doing my presentation on PTSD signs and symptoms. Um, my choice in presentation was just because I personally have PTSD. I was one of those that they didn't really diagnose PTSD. What they diagnosed was anxiety because mine wasn't as severe, but they did say I do have a little bit of PTSD, but not enough where they would say that that's what it is. So I'm going to start my presentation on PTSD signs and symptoms. So I was reading the prologue in Vander Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and I chose 4 quotes that I felt were pretty good. One of them was, one does not have to be a combat soldier or visit a refugee camp in Syria or the Congo to encounter trauma. This to me was true because you can be anybody to encounter any kind of trauma. You could be, even a baby can encounter trauma. That, happens quite often. You hear these stories, and that happens a lot. And then another one was, trauma happens to us, our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Again, kind of goes into the first quote that I posted, or that I liked. It can happen to literally anybody. Anybody you know. Anybody you may not know. Strangers, in fact. Another one I liked was, trauma affects not only those who are directly exposed to it, but also those around them. This can be true. In my experience, my trauma that I have experienced, it affects my son in a way that he's never met his biological father, but that, you know, wasn't necessarily because of me, but because of what his bio father had done. And he just hasn't ever asked about him. So he just has never seen him. So that's where that comes into play in my perspective. But others, they could experience the trauma and then they, let their children or family know what happened, and then their family ends up like somehow exposed to it or experiencing it, even if they were not necessarily the ones who have experienced it. And then another thing was, trauma by definition is unbearable and intolerable. I liked this quote, but I never really understood it. But I liked it because it's, some people have trauma so bad that, yeah, it's very unbearable and intolerable. They just can't handle it, and it's sad, but it's true. Okay. Then I went on to explain what is PTSD. So PTSD is also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, but PTSD is short for that. It is a mental health disorder caused by different forms of traumatic events. They can just be really stressful or really terrifying situations that people are in. That could be any kind of traumatic situation. It can either affect you personally, or it can be an event that you just witnessed or learned about. So, with my son, he was only 3 weeks when this situation happened, so he didn't really, he wasn't able to actually witness it, but he did at the same time. Not that he can remember, but he's almost 7. I have told him, bits and pieces, so he knows about it. And he's just the sweetest kid in the world. And that's how I hope he grows up to be. is just the sweetest kid in the world, as I'm raising him. Um, and I'm hoping to raise him to be an amazing man. And that's all any mother can hope. And, sometimes it just doesn't work out like that. So, situations like that happen. But I think that he's going to grow up to be an amazing man. He's amazing to his baby sister, and he's just amazing all around. So I think he's going to be, I don't think that he's going to be affected by any of this as he gets older, but it does happen. So I can only hope that it doesn't. And I don't think it will, but okay. So symptoms, they can happen within the first 3 months after the traumatic event has occurred, or, it may not appear until years after the traumatic event has occurred. Some people experience something like, say, if they're in like the war, they may not experience, or their symptoms may not appear until years after the war. But it's kind of manifested in their bodies and eventually comes up to the surface. And there are 4 types of symptoms, according to things that I have read. Let's see. So the 4 types of symptoms. There's the intrusive memories, which are unwanted, distressing memories that are on repeat in your brain. Reliving the traumatic event as if it is still happening. Upsetting dreams or nightmares about the traumatic event. Severe emotional distress or reactions to things that remind you of the traumatic event. So this is something that I personally know that I have. Sometimes, I could be just waking up in the middle of the night to feed my daughter, or just wake up in the middle of the night for no reason. And next thing I know, all of a sudden I've got memories going of what happened. And, it happens. Mine, no, are not nearly as severe as others at all. Then there's also avoidance, trying not to think or talk about the traumatic event, staying away from anything or anyone that reminds you of the traumatic event. That, I will say, is not something that I have experienced. But I know there are some kids or even adults, that do this. Ooh, sorry. Okay, negative changes in thinking and mood. Negative thoughts about yourself, others, or the world. Ongoing negative emotions like fear, blame, guilt, anger, or shame. Memory problems that are partly about remembering important aspects of the traumatic event. Feeling detached from family and friends, not being interested in doing things you used to like doing. Having a hard time feeling positive emotions. Feeling emotionally numb. So in the past, I had negative thoughts about myself, but it was never so severe. I just took it as, it's just my depression. There's also changes in physical and emotional reactions. So, like being easily scared, always being on guard, self-destructive behavior like drinking too much or speeding, trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, irritable, angry outbursts or aggressive behavior, physical reactions like sweating, rapid breathing, fast heartbeat, or shaking. So I've always been easily scared, so that could probably not be anything to do with my PTSD, but others used to not be easily scared, and then all of a sudden, boom, it changes. And then there's symptoms for 6 and under. So 6 and under are a little bit different, but not by much. So, like, they tend to reenact the traumatic event or aspects of it through play. They also tend to have scary dreams that might or might not have aspects of the traumatic event. So the causes, there's extremely stressful experiences, including the amount and severity of trauma you have gone through in life. Inherited mental health risks like a family history of anxiety or depression, which mine, I have a family history of anxiety or depression. A lot of family members in my family have it. Um, Inherited features of your personality, also known as your temperament. The way your brain regulates the chemicals and hormones your body releases in response to stress. You go through, see, or learn about an event involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual assault. And this happens a lot more than you would even think or want to believe, unfortunately, to a lot of people. Now, there's risk factors. So, people of all ages can have PTSD. As I was saying earlier, babies can get it because, if they experience something that they obviously aren't going to remember as they get older, but you never know, they might, you know. Um, Unfortunately, things happen, and it's really sad. Have severe or long-lasting traumatic experiences, like say domestic violence. Some domestic violence situations go on for years. I have a cousin who was in a domestic violence situation for 5 years, and then she finally got out, and she had a child with this person, and she just, because she was married to him, she felt like, she should stick it out because that's her husband and all this other thing. But then she realized after 5 years that even if, he's her husband, it's not a situation she should have her child in. So she left. Were physically injured during the traumatic event. I was. I actually have a bad knee now because of my traumatic event. And it's going to be with me for the rest of my life. But, as much as it is annoying to have, it's like a reminder every time it hurts what happened. But you get used to it. You do get used to it. Some obviously not so much. But me, I have just gotten used to it. You have been exposed to other trauma early in life, like childhood abuse. There's sexual abuse, or there's even like physical abuse. As I said earlier, sometimes babies experience this. Children experience this. It's pretty sad. It does happen. You have a job that exposes you to traumatic events like the military or a first responder. Have other mental health problems like anxiety or depression. Drink too much or misuse drugs. Do not have a good support system with family and friends. Have blood relatives with mental health problems like PTSD or depression. This happens quite often with a lot of families. I have a good support system with family and friends, which is why it was never as severe for me, and it still is not nearly as severe. Like, I've got not as many symptoms as I used to have, which is great for me. Traumatic events that raise risk: combat exposure, childhood abuse, physical and sexual abuse, sexual violence, physical assault, being threatened with a weapon, or an accident. Who develops PTSD? Anyone at any age, combat veterans, people have experienced serious events. Some people have not experienced the dangerous event but have learned about it. 6 of every 100 people will experience PTSD, which this was kind of surprising because it seems like a lot more than that. But at the same time, I'm not a scientist. I don't, know any of this. So this is my first time learning about stuff like this. There was a lot more people that I have read have experienced it than I would think. So, 6 out of 100 people makes sense. So to be diagnosed An adult has to experience these for at least 1 month, at least one re-experiencing symptom, at least one avoidance symptom, at least two arousal and reactivity symptoms, at least two cognition and mood symptoms. And these are the symptoms that we have gone over earlier also. Just they were named a little different, but this is the symptoms we have already gone over. So children and teens react to trauma by wetting the bed even after being potty trained, forgetting how or not able to talk, acting out the event during play, being unusually clingy with a parent or other adult. Why do some get PTSD and some do not? Risk factors and resilience factors. We've went over the risk factors earlier, but the resilience factors are seeking out and receiving support from family, friends, or support groups, learning to feel okay with your actions in response to the traumatic event, having a coping strategy for getting through and learning from the traumatic event, being prepared and able to respond to upsetting events as they happen, despite being afraid. Treatment for PTSD. Psychotherapy, also known as talk therapy. It can provide support, education, and guidance to people with PTSD and their families. One-on-one or in group settings, lasts 6 to 12 weeks, but can last longer. This is something I'm just learning about this year. I did not know that psychotherapy actually existed. I did not know that it was even a thing, honestly, until this year in this class. And then there's medication. I take, Zoloft, or they also call it sertraline. That's what I take. It's a SSRI. It's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also known as SSRIs, which are a type of antidepressant medication to help treat PTSD or even depression. It can treat depression as well. Complex PTSD, it's still PTSD, but it's like the more severe PTSD compared to the regular PTSD. Complex PTSD is due to long-term trauma from situations that are still occurring, like repeated domestic violence or living in a prisoner of war camp, causing you to be under the control of someone else for long periods of time. So complex PTSD symptoms, being aggressive, misusing drugs or alcohol, experiencing rage, depression, or panic, finding it hard to connect with people or make friends, or feeling worthless or filled with guilt. So I know that I don't have complex PTSD, but there are things on this list, like with me, I experienced depression. And I had times in the past where I felt worthless. And there are times that, like, even just telling a white lie, I get so filled with guilt that I can't. It, like, eats me alive. And I have to be honest and I have to tell the truth. That's just what happens. But I don't have the complex PTSD. I have the regular one. Now, dissociative symptoms caused by complex PTSD. Depersonalization. You feel detached from your body, like you're observing your own experiences from the outside of your body. Almost like you're watching a movie. Derealization. Experiencing your surroundings like they aren't real or are from a dream. So kind of similar. Almost like you're essentially watching from a distance. 15% of people with PTSD experience these. Which makes sense because, again, I have never heard of these, really, until this class. Now, the past year prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder among adults, as you can see, This is a chart that I found from 2001 to 2003. So the statistics for 2001 and 2003, 3.6% of US adults had PTSD. PTSD was higher for females, 5.2%, than males, 1.8%. The lifetime prevalence of PTSD was 6.8%. You'll see these next three percentages on the next slide on another graph that I found. 36.6% of adults had serious impairment due to PTSD. 33.1% had moderate impairment, and 30.2% had mild impairment. This was, again, in 2001 to 2003. And the next one, we're talking about PTSD among adolescents, 2001 to 2004. 5% of adolescents had PTSD. 1.5% had severe impairment. And again, PTSD was higher in females, 8%, than in males, 2.3%, which goes to show you that females tend to have more traumatic events that cause PTSD than males. They not saying that, males don't have the same amount of traumatic events. They just might not experience the PTSD from it. They might experience more traumatic events, but may end up just not experiencing anything. So this is the lifetime prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder among the adolescents in 2001 to 2004. And then these are my references. So I read The Body Keeps the Score from Vanderkook. And then I found a website on post-traumatic stress disorder made by the Mayo Clinic staff. And then I read another website from the National Institute of Mental Health staff, which is also known as NIH. I actually had two of those on post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I found another website on WebMD on PTSD signs and symptoms by Whitbourne. So that was my final presentation. And I hope that you liked it. I hope that it gave you some more insight on my research that I did. So thank you for watching.